Tonight, we drift softly into the candlelit corridors of ancient Rome, not the Rome of stoic senators or marching legions, but of velvet, draped halls, silk, veiled glances and dangerous whispers. Behind palace walls, Rome was a city built on power, masculine power, loud and armored. But tonight, we won't walk with the Caesars. No, we'll follow softer footsteps, slippered ones, echoing behind closed doors. We will not study the men who ruled with swords, but the women who wielded subtler weapons, poison, persuasion, seduction, and silence. Some were called seductresses, others murderers, a few were even worshipped as goddesses. But history, as you know, does not always tell the truth kindly. And Roman history, it was written mostly by the very men they threatened. So let us close our eyes and step into the shadows where these women lived, not just dangerous, but brilliant, calculating, tragic, and often misunderstood. Let the fire crackle quietly beside you as we begin this sleepy journey through veiled intrigues, family betrayals, and the dangerous beauty of power in a city that never slept. This is the story of Rome's most dangerous women, the role of Roman women. Settle in, let the world outside melt away. We are entering a quieter space now, one stitched together with the hum of distant lyres, the scent of olive oil lamps flickering in hidden alcoves, and the rustle of silk across cold marble floors. This is ancient Rome, yes, but not the one of noisy triumphs or chariots clattering over cobbled roads. This Rome is interior, quiet, behind the veil. It is easy to imagine that the Roman world was a stage ruled solely by men in crimson, draped togas, barking orders across senate halls and conquering lands with their polished armor gleaming under Mediterranean sun, and in many ways that's true. Rome was a deeply patriarchal society. It was built on structure, on the pillars of law, bloodline, and order. But beneath that structure, beneath the official histories and marble monuments, were women, not always seen, not always named, but always present, watching, waiting, and sometimes gently steering the course of empires with a whisper instead of a war cry. Roman women were, in the legal sense, under the control of men their entire lives. As girls, they were under the patria potestas, the authority of their fathers. As wives, that power transferred to their husbands. They could not vote, they could not hold public office, and they certainly could not openly lead armies or empires. But don't be misled by the silence of the law books, for in the hush of domestic life, many women learned the art of influence. And influence in Rome could be just as deadly as a sword. In fact, it often was more dangerous because it was harder to see coming. Let your imagination wander for a moment. Picture a young Roman woman, perhaps the daughter of a senator. She's learning to read poetry, not for leisure, but so she can quote it later to win favor at a dinner gathering. She's practicing the delicate art of choosing her words carefully, of nodding at just the right time, of appearing agreeable while gently guiding conversations. It is not so different, really, from learning to wield a dagger. One slice too obvious, and you're caught. But done with care, and no one ever sees the blood. The home domus was technically the woman's realm, but in that quiet realm, Rome's political future was often forged. Marriages were not love stories but transactions. Alliances formed with the soft pressure of veiled women sitting in atriums, discussing dowries and family trees like a strategist preparing for war. And the most skilled women were not loud. No, they were careful, measured, dangerous in the most Roman of ways, through lineage, loyalty, and legacy. Roman men feared that which they could not control, and so the most powerful women became threats by simply existing within the bounds of what was expected, and quietly pushing beyond it. It was often through their sons that Roman women extended their influence. A mother could mold the future of the Republic by shaping the next consul, the next general, or the next emperor. Behind every young Roman man in a laurel crown There was often a mother with her hands on the strings, pulling them with a smile, or sometimes with a scowl. You see, Roman women were not given power. They had to carve it out of shadows, and so they learned to manipulate public image, to form private alliances, to offer support to favored candidates behind the scenes. They became masters of suggestion. Some slipped poison into goblets, others simply slipped rumors into ears. Either way, the result was the same. Even the very language of Roman morality warned against female boldness. There was a Roman ideal pudicitia, a kind of modesty, chastity, self-restraint that women were expected to embody. Public virtue was a man's domain, private virtue a woman's. But what happens when a woman doesn't stay in her private domain? When she dares to step into the forum, not with her feet, but with her influence, she is called dangerous. She is remembered. She becomes a threat to the empire, not because she holds a sword, but because she holds something far older, a mind as sharp as any blade, and a patience born of being overlooked. These are the women history remembers with suspicion, like Livia Drusilla, the calculating wife of Augustus, whose long, still presence in the palace outlasted emperors and whispered of slow poison. Or Agrippina the Younger, who may have murdered her own husband to elevate her son Nero to the throne, and paid dearly for it. Or Messalina, remembered not for her mind, but for her alleged excess and sexuality, though some say that reputation was merely propaganda written by men uneasy with her independence. For every woman remembered as a seductress, there is another whose legacy was erased entirely, lost in the dust of scrolls too inconvenient to preserve. Roman society made it difficult for women to rise through official channels, and so those who did, those who truly made themselves heard, had to be cleverer, bolder, or far more ruthless than their male counterparts. They had to make a space for themselves where no space had been given, and yet they did. They left their mark in letters and rumors, in statues with softened features but sharpened intentions, in coins that bore their faces, in laws rewritten behind the scenes, in children raised not just to rule, but to remember where their real allegiance lay. Still, many of them were punished not always in life, but certainly in history. The Roman historian Tacitus once wrote that women's influence must be kept in check, and he ensured that the stories of women who strayed beyond their boundaries were soaked in scandal and suspicion. Were these women truly dangerous, or were they simply disobedient to the roles they were expected to play? Perhaps the real danger was that they refused to be quiet, and tonight we will not let them be. So as you settle deeper into sleep, let your thoughts drift like incense smoke across a Roman villa, through open courtyards, past quiet conversations, into candle-lit rooms where women planned not with swords or shields, but with glances, alliances, and timeless patience. Their power was rarely shouted. It was whispered. It was not always visible, but it was always felt. They were wives, mothers, daughters, and yes, manipulators, poisoners, queens. They were, in every sense of the word, dangerous, and tonight, under the safe hush of your covers, as the fire crackles beside us, you will meet them one by one, but not just as villains or victims. You will meet them as they were, women in a world that was never made for them, who still managed to shape it, quietly, completely, and forever. Livia Drusilla, the flicker of flame in the corner, softens the edges of the past, blurring the harsh outlines of marble busts and sharp Roman sandals. Tonight we follow quieter footsteps, those of a woman who never raised her voice in the Senate, never led an army into battle, and yet guided the direction of the Roman Empire with a calm hand and an unblinking gaze. Her name was Livia Drusilla, wife of the first emperor, mother of the second, and the eternal matron of a dynasty that would cast shadows across centuries. But Livia's story does not begin in golden halls. It begins in the waning days of the Roman Republic, a time when the old world was unraveling. Civil wars stained the roads with betrayal, and the names of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Mark Antony still rang loudly in the streets. Into this chaos was born a girl of noble lineage, with skin like pressed parchment and a gaze that, they say, rarely gave anything away. She was married first to a man named Tiberius Claudius Nero, not a particularly distinguished husband, though he was loyal to the old republican cause. But history, as it often does, had other plans. One day she caught the eye of a rising young politician, Octavian, later known as Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar himself. It is said that Octavian was instantly captivated. Livia, elegant and reserved, seemed to embody the virtues he wished to project onto his new Roman Empire: modesty, loyalty, calm under pressure. The story goes that Livia was still pregnant by her first husband when Octavian insisted on marrying her. And so, in one of Rome's more peculiar love stories, she was taken as his wife before her child was even born. It could have been a scandal, but it wasn't, because Livia had a way of making even the most controversial things seem inevitable. Like a tide pulling gently at your ankles until, before you know it, your knee deep in water. She bore no children to Augustus, but she brought with her 2 sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. These boys would grow in the shadow of the emperor's golden vision, raised not merely as noble children, but as instruments of the imperial future. And Livia, Livia watched over it all with quiet patience. She did not rant, she did not rage, she did not storm the Senate. She simply observed, listened, advised. She was the voice behind the throne, the one who smoothed the fabric of empire with invisible hands. But whispers began to follow her, the kind that trail behind powerful women like perfume and smoke. Whispers that she orchestrated deaths discreetly, of course, that the heir apparent, Marcellus, Augustus's beloved nephew, had died too suddenly, that Gaius and Lucius, the emperor's grandchildren and favored successors, both faded too quickly and too conveniently. Each death removed an obstacle between her own son, Tiberius, and the imperial throne. Poison, they murmured. A touch in a goblet, a concoction stirred by a servant, or perhaps not even that. Perhaps it was just fear, cleverly sown into the minds of rivals. Perhaps Livia knew that a well-timed rumor could kill faster than any tincture. No one ever proved anything, and that, in itself, is very Roman. You see, in a world where men shouted their victories in the forum, Livia's power was that of silence. She wore her virtue like a cloak, modest, composed, ever the dutiful wife. She avoided extravagance. She sponsored temples. She made offerings to the gods. She played the role so perfectly that no one dared accuse her outright, but many wondered. Augustus adored her. He trusted her beyond measure, so much so, in fact, that when he finally passed from this world, whether by time or touch, no one can say he left everything in Livia's hands. In his will, he adopted her son Tiberius officially, and bequeathed a portion of his estate to Livia herself. She was even granted the unprecedented title of Augusta, making her the first woman in Roman history to be elevated to such a rank. It was more than symbolic. It was revolutionary. She now stood not behind power, but beside it. Imagine her, cloaked in pale robes, walking slowly through the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. She did not smile often. Her words were precise, her gestures restrained, but in her silence entire careers rose and fell. Courtiers bowed lower in her presence. Her eyes lingered longer than most, and yet the people adored her, or rather, they revered her. Rome had always worshipped virtue in theory, and Livia gave them the image of it in flesh. Still, even as Tiberius became emperor, he resented her. Perhaps it was the weight of living in her shadow, of being shaped by a mother who never praised, only expected. Perhaps it was the gnawing suspicion that she had cleared the path to power not for his sake, but for her own legacy. He withdrew from Rome for long periods, retreating to the island of Capri. He distanced himself from public duties, and, tellingly, he began to restrict Livia's political involvement. he refused to grant her full honors she requested after Augustus's death. He blocked the formal decree that would have had her called Mother of the Nation. Even in the family she had carefully constructed, Livia was still too much, too powerful, too present. But she endured. For decades, she outlived most of her rivals. She outlasted gossip, illness, and aging. Her portrait was etched onto coins an honor typically reserved for gods and emperors. Statues of her adorned temples and public buildings. The people did not fear her as they might fear a cruel emperor, but they respected her. They whispered her name in the same breath as Rome itself. Livia died in the year 29 C, at the age of 86. In a time when few women even reached old age, she had not only survived, but shaped an empire. She was buried alongside Augustus, though not at first honored as she might have hoped. It would take her grandson, Emperor Claudius, to finally deify her. She became Deva Augusta, a goddess in the Roman pantheon, immortal officially. Yet the rumors persisted, like smoke clinging to a cloak. They linger in the writings of Tacitus and Suetonius, historians who painted her as a shadowy figure, calm and cruel. But even those who doubted her virtue could not ignore her brilliance. Was she a murderer? Perhaps. Was she a manipulator? Certainly. But most of all, she was a survivor. In a world that did not allow women to lead, she led from within. In a city of fire and stone, she moved like water soft, patient, and unstoppable. And now, centuries later, as you rest beneath the soft weight of blankets, with only the quiet hiss of imagined torches and the rustle of Roman silk echoing in your ears, you can picture her. She is not loud, she does not speak, she only watches and roam. Yes, even mighty Rome listened. Fulvia, let your body grow heavier as you settle deeper beneath the covers. Let the firelight flicker softly in your imagination, casting slow shadows across a painted Roman wall. We move now from silent corridors to the battlefield, not of swords and armor alone, but of letters, alliances, and the sharp-tongued defiance of one extraordinary woman. Her name was Fulvia, not a name sung by poets or inscribed on imperial coins, but a name once spoken with a strange mix of fear and fascination in the streets of late Republican Rome. A woman who did not whisper behind curtains or quietly influence from a distance. No, Fulvia stepped into the fray with a sharp gaze and sharper ambition. She lived in the last crumbling years of the Roman Republic, and as the old world broke apart, she did what few women dared. She broke with it. You could say she was born into it, the art of controversy. She came from a well-connected aristocratic family, the gens Fulvia, with long ties to the Roman political world. But Fulvia was not interested in staying in the shadows of that world. She wanted to shape it boldly, publicly, with the force of her will and the fury of her words. Her journey began, as many Roman women's lives did, through marriage. But Fulvia's husbands were not ordinary men. Her first was Publius Clodius Pulcher, a populist firebrand, a man who riled the Senate and brought the fury of the plebeians to Rome's patrician gates. He was wild, theatrical, and endlessly provocative, and Fulvia matched him stride for stride. Clodius was assassinated in 52 BC, stabbed by his political enemies on the Appian Way. Most Roman widows might have disappeared into mourning, retired quietly, vanished from public life. Not Fulvia. When her husband's body was returned to her, she displayed his wounds in the forum publicly, graphically. She made sure the people saw them. She pointed to the deep cuts across his chest, the blood crusted into his robes. It was a performance and a political one. She used grief like a dagger and anger like a rallying cry. The city nearly descended into riot. The Senate house was burned. Rome remembered her, and she was just getting started. She remarried twice, and each time not for love, but for political alliance. Her second husband was Gaius Scribonius Curio, another man who challenged the conservative elite. He, too, died young, fighting in Caesar's civil war. Again, Fulvia mourned publicly, and again she moved forward. Her third and final husband was Mark Antony. Yes, that Mark Antony, the general, the lover of Cleopatra, the rival to Octavian. But before Cleopatra ever entered the picture, there was Fulvia, the first woman to truly stand beside him politically. She was not just a wife, she was a partner, a strategist, a storm in human form. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Rome fell into chaos, and Fulvia, now married to Antony, saw opportunity. She didn't wait in the background. She stepped forward. Her husband and his allies formed the second triumvirate: Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Together they divided the Roman world among themselves. But while Antony was away commanding troops and chasing alliances, Fulvia remained in Rome. And there she did something no Roman woman had done before. She governed not in name, not with a title, but in practice. She held meetings. She managed alliances. She handed out orders in her husband's name, and sometimes in her own. She raised funds. She met with soldiers. When Antony's enemies tried to seize property, Fulvia personally intervened. Roman writers, of course, found this deeply unsettling. They mocked her, called her bold, mannish, immodest. She was said to wear a sword at her side, to speak in the language of generals. Whether this was true or simply an invention by uncomfortable male historians, we'll never know. But what is certain is that Fulvia, through sheer force of presence, was shaping the destiny of Rome in a way no woman before her had dared. Then came the great betrayal. Antony and Octavian, once allies, turned against each other, and Fulvia chose war. Yes, war with Antony abroad. Fulvia, along with Antony's brother, Lucius Antonius, raised an army. She recruited soldiers loyal to her husband's cause. She traveled through Italy, making speeches, appearing at military camps, calling men to action. She offered land to veterans, played to their loyalties, evoked the memory of Caesar. She became the face of resistance against Octavian, and Octavian noticed. He would later claim she started the war out of jealousy, that Fulvia, enraged by Antony's growing closeness to Cleopatra, acted out of love and wounded pride. But Fulvia was not a woman led by passion. She was led by calculation. She saw Octavian as a threat to her family's position, to Antony's power, to her own legacy. She wanted her sons to inherit a world shaped by Antony, not ruled by Octavian. The war, later called the Perusine War, ended poorly for her. After holding out in the city of Perusia, Fulvia and Lucius were surrounded and eventually surrendered. Octavian spared their lives. He saw little point in killing her. After all, her political utility was already crumbling. But Fulvia didn't beg. She didn't break. She accepted defeat with the same steel she had accepted power. She was exiled to Sicyon in Greece, and there, shortly after she died, some said it was illness, others heartbreak. Antony himself may have blamed her for the war, for his tarnished position. But even he, in a quiet moment, must have recognized the magnitude of what she had done. Fulvia was the only Roman woman in history to lead a military campaign against the state, the only one to challenge a future emperor with troops of her own. She had occupied a city, raised an army, touched the very nerve of Roman masculinity and power, and lived briefly as their equal. History did not know what to do with her, so it buried her in whispers. Later generations remembered her mostly through the words of men who couldn't comprehend her. They painted her as shrill, meddling, overbearing. But if you read between the lines, if you trace the edges of those tired accusations, you begin to see the shape of someone extraordinary. Fulvia was not dangerous because she whispered in shadows. She was dangerous because she shouted in the forum, because she refused to be small, because she stepped onto a battlefield and dared to command. And now, as you rest here in this quiet hour of the night, with the winds of history rustling gently through time, you can almost hear her voice, firm, deliberate, unrepentant. Not a queen, not an empress, just a woman who looked at the highest wall in Rome and climbed it anyway. She left no temples behind, no glowing legacy etched in marble, but she left a precedent, an echo so strong that even emperors remembered to fear ambition wrapped in a woman's voice, and that may be the most dangerous legacy of all. Messalina let the day's worries slip slowly into silence. The world outside grows dim, and the fire at your feet burns low and steady, casting flickers across marble statues and velvet, draped doorways in the mind. We drift now into the palace of Claudius, where footsteps echo in moonlit halls and whispers linger longer than voices. And at the center of these whispers stands Messalina. The name alone rings like the snap of silk, soft, elegant, and edged with danger. In the eyes of many Roman historians, she was a temptress beyond measure, a seductress who corrupted the purity of the empire. But names, like mirrors, can distort the face they reflect. And tonight, as sleep gently gathers around your senses, we walk deeper into the cool corridors of power to listen quietly, patiently, for the truth beneath the scandal. Valeria Messalina. She was born into one of the most ancient and noble families of Rome, the gens Valeria, connected by blood to Augustus himself. Privilege wrapped around her like a second skin. She was married young, as noble girls often were, to Tiberius Claudius Drusus, better known to us as the future Emperor Claudius. When they married, Claudius was not yet emperor. He was older, awkward, scholarly, laughed at by the court, the kind of man who preferred dusty scrolls to strategy meetings, and who walked with a slight limp. No one saw a future Caesar in him, but Messalina she may have seen something else, a path, a throne waiting to be filled, a quiet man she could shape. When Claudius unexpectedly became emperor in 41 CE, after the chaotic assassination of Caligula, Messalina suddenly found herself Empress of Rome. She was barely in her 20s, and she stepped into that role not with timidity, but with quiet, determined control. Almost immediately, Messalina became a force in the palace. Officially, she was a wife and mother, but behind the scenes, she played a far more complicated role. She involved herself in court politics, she secured allies, she punished rivals, she rewarded loyalty with land, offices, and quiet power. She was not merely decorative, she was strategic, and yet history remembers none of this. Instead, they remember her body. The ancient historians, chief among them Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, crafted a portrait of Messalina soaked in scandal and shadows. According to them, she was insatiable, lustful beyond imagination, a woman who used her sexuality like a weapon. They tell us of affairs too numerous to count, of noblemen summoned to her chambers in the dead of night, of secret liaisons behind palace doors. But most of all, they tell us of one story, one final, shattering scandal. The year was 48 CE. Claudius, ever trusting, ever distracted, was away from the palace. And in his absence, Messalina did something no Roman empress had ever dared. She married another man. Yes, married. The man was Gaius Silius, a handsome, ambitious senator, young, bold, and dangerously popular. Ancient sources claim it was no affair, but a full wedding, performed in public, with guests, music, and a feast. Messalina, they say, believed that Claudius could be easily removed, that she and Silius could rule in his place. Madness, perhaps, but perhaps not. Maybe she saw in Claudius the weakness others overlooked. Maybe she felt the tides turning. Maybe the palace filled with spies, plots, and ambitions pressed her into making a desperate move. But the plot unraveled quickly. Claudius was informed. Shocked, betrayed, and confused, he listened as his advisers painted Messalina as a traitor. Not just adulterous, but treasonous. The Senate turned against her, and in the blink of an eye, the empire did too. She fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a quiet, shaded retreat, where fountains murmured and birds chirped softly. There, in the dappled light, she waited. Messalina still believed Claudius would forgive her, that he would see through the panic, that love or habit or pity would stay his hand. But the palace had made its choice. A centurion arrived, and there, among the rose-covered terraces and gentle pools, Messalina was forced to take her own life. The stories say she hesitated, that she trembled, that the soldier grew impatient and finished the job himself. We don't know for certain. The garden is long gone now, but the image remains. A young woman, perhaps no older than 28, once the most powerful woman in Rome, dying not with a scream but with silence. Her name forever marked by scandal, but was she truly what the historians claimed, or was she simply a woman who stepped too far into a man's world and was punished for it? The truth, as always, is misted over with time. Messalina was not the first empress, but she may have been the first to be destroyed so publicly, so thoroughly, by the written word. The stories that survive paint her as wicked because she was not quiet, because she dared to want more, because she used her body not as a burden, but as a bargaining chip. Some say she was protecting her son, Britannicus, that by allying with Silius, she hoped to secure a stronger future for her child before Claudius could be swayed by other heirs. Others say she truly loved Silius, that for a brief moment she stepped away from the cold games of the court and reached for something warmer. Or maybe she was cornered. Maybe she knew that every move she made in the palace was being watched, that rivals were sharpening their knives, that a misstep, any misstep, could cost her everything, and so she leapt instead of falling. Her legacy is one of contradiction. A mother, an empress, a seductress, a traitor, a victim, a strategist, a scapegoat. In her death, Claudius barely spoke her name again. Her statues were torn down, her images defaced. The palace was scrubbed clean of her memory. But Rome does not forget so easily, and neither does history. Even now, centuries later, Messalina's name is a symbol. In some circles it is whispered with disdain, in others with fascination. And in the quiet hours of the night, as sleep begins to draw you deeper into stillness, her story feels less like scandal and more like tragedy. A woman born into power, punished for using it, a figure surrounded by rumor, but rarely allowed her own voice. And in the soft, fading candlelight of history, we begin to see her not as monstrous, but as human. The corridors of ancient Rome are filled with such ghosts women whose ambition was too sharp, too visible, too dangerous. But they lived, they shaped, they endured, and Messalina endures still, not in marble, but in memory, not in honor, but in curiosity. And here, in the hush between one breath and the next, she is remembered once more, not with judgment, not with shame, but with softness. A girl in silk, an empress with eyes like daggers, and a name that even now refuses to sleep. Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus. The torches flicker low in the quiet corners of your imagination. The fire in your mind's hearth hisses softly, casting sleepy golden hues across marble columns and shaded gardens. Rome slumbers in twilight now, hushed under the weight of memory, and there, in that delicate space between greatness and disgrace, waits Julia. Julia the Elder. She was born into destiny, the only child of a man who would become the most powerful figure in Roman history, Gaius Octavius, later known to all the world as Augustus, Rome's first emperor, the man who reshaped the Republic into an empire with quiet firmness and endless patience. And Julia was his daughter, his only child, his legacy. She was born into gold and expectation. Every step of her early life was wrapped in silken ceremony and watched with calculating eyes. The moment she entered the world in 39 BC, she ceased being a child and became a symbol of dynastic hope, of political stability, of the future. She was educated like no other Roman girl of her generation, tutored in Greek and Latin, philosophy and rhetoric, taught to walk with grace, to speak with poise, to appear virtuous and compliant while understanding the currents of power, swirling beneath every conversation. She was not a pawn. She was being molded into a queen without a crown. And Augustus had plans. So many plans. You see, for Augustus, family was politics, bloodline was empire, and Julia's blood, his blood, was sacred. Through her he would bind allies, control enemies, shape generations. Her first marriage at age 14 was to her cousin, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the golden boy of Rome. Young, handsome, and favored by Augustus, all signs pointed toward Marcellus becoming emperor someday, with Julia at his side as empress. But fate had other ideas. Marcellus died suddenly, perhaps of illness. Some whispered of poison, as Romans often did. Widowed before she could even grow into womanhood, Julia became a political prize once more. She was next married to Agrippa, Augustus's most trusted general, nearly 30 years her senior. A strange match, some thought, but practical. Together, they had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, every one of them destined, in her father's eyes, for imperial greatness. Gaius, Lucius, Agrippina, Julia the Younger, Posthumus. Through Julia, Augustus saw an entire dynasty stretching into the future. And still it wasn't enough. When Agrippa died, Augustus again controlled her fate. This time he married her to her stepbrother Tiberius, the future emperor, but this match was colder, political, joyless. Julia and Tiberius clashed like flint and steel. He was sullen, reserved, brooding. She was witty, cultured, beloved by the Roman people. He resented her popularity. She resented his silence, and somewhere in that loveless union something shifted. Julia, once the golden daughter of Augustus, began to drift away from the image he had so carefully constructed. The sources written, of course, by the men of Rome tell us she took lovers. Many lovers, senators, poets, noblemen, affairs whispered about in the dark corners of porticos, meetings in gardens after dusk, laughs that rang too freely in marble courtyards. They say she mocked her father's moral reforms, that she defied his laws against adultery with deliberate cruelty, that she made a spectacle of her rebellion, challenging the very image of Roman virtue Augustus sought to build. But is that the full truth, or just the version history wanted us to believe? What we know for certain is this. In 2 BC, Augustus acted. Swiftly, publicly, Julia was arrested, his own daughter, and charged under the very adultery laws he had imposed on the people. It was a cruel irony. The laws meant to elevate Roman morality had ensnared his own blood. She was exiled, banished from Rome, sent away to the barren island of Pandateria, a wind-swept strip of rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea. No parties, no lovers, no letters. She was allowed no wine, no luxury, no visitors except the most essential. The once luminous center of Rome's future was now alone, surrounded by waves and silence. Imagine her, if you will, draped in coarse wool instead of silk, hair unpinned, eyes turned toward the sea. Her laughter, once echoing through palaces, now swallowed by salt wind. She was not yet 40. Augustus never forgave her. Some say he refused to even mention her name again. Others claim he regretted his harshness, but was too bound by politics and pride to reverse it. Years passed. Eventually, she was moved from the island to a less isolated exile on the mainland. But she never returned to Rome, never reclaimed her place. Her sons Gaius and Lucius both died young. Her remaining son, Posthumus, was disinherited, exiled, and likely murdered. And so, one by one, her children, the jewels of Augustus's hopes, were lost to time and suspicion. Julia's bloodline, once the hope of an empire, became a curse. She died quietly in 14C, the same year her father did, alone, forgotten by the world that once watched her every move. No funeral, no honors, no public mourning, just silence. But history, like the sea that surrounded her exile, does not stay still. In later years, whispers returned. Scholars questioned the stories. Was she truly the scandalous woman painted by her enemies? Or had she simply stepped beyond the tight lines her father had drawn for her? Had she been dangerous or just defiant? It is tempting to reduce her to tragedy, to make her only a victim of politics. But Julia was not meek. She was not timid. She played the game of empire as best she could, with charm, intelligence, and ambition. She may have loved, she may have laughed too loudly, she may have broken rules that were not meant for breaking, but perhaps in doing so, she became something even more dangerous than her father imagined. Human, complex and unforgettable, tonight, as your thoughts drift softly toward rest, think not of Julia the scandal, or Julia the exile. Think instead of Julia, the girl walking through the Palatine gardens, trailing her fingers along cool marble, reciting lines of Virgil under her breath, laughing with her children, conversing with poets, wearing a crown made not of laurel but of expectation. She was not allowed to rule, but she shaped the dynasty that did. She was not granted forgiveness, but she was never erased. And in the quiet hush of night, beneath stars older than Rome itself, her voice returns, not as a warning, but as a whisper. Not all rebellions look like wars. Some simply look like women who will not bend. Agrippina the Younger, a woman whose ambition shaped emperors and whose shadow stretched across an empire. Somewhere between the velvet darkness of Roman night and the low flicker of firelight, you begin to feel the shape of her. She does not arrive with a shout, nor with the heavy tread of legionnaires. No, her presence settles like silk, slow and sure. Her name is spoken in whispers and warnings. Agrippina, Agrippina the Younger, daughter of a general, sister of an emperor, wife of another, and mother of yet another. Each man she loved ruled Rome. And perhaps, for a moment, she did too. But this is not a tale of kindness, nor of cruelty. This is a tale of closeness to power, the kind that burns if you reach too far. She was born in 15C, to Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, both mighty names. Her father, a war hero adored by the legions. Her mother, a descendant of Augustus himself. To say Agrippina had imperial blood would be an understatement. It pulsed in every part of her. But power in Rome came at a price, and often it was a woman's fate to pay it first. She was just a child when her father died mysteriously in Syria. Some said poison, some said politics. Her mother believed Emperor Tiberius had done it. The family fell from favor. Her brothers were imprisoned. Her mother was exiled and starved to death. One by one they vanished. Except Agrippina. She survived. And survival in Rome, as we've learned, is its own form of danger. When she came of age, she was married to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man described in the driest Roman terms as detestable in every respect. He was powerful, yes, but cruel, crude, violent. With him she had one child, a boy with cold blue eyes and a peculiar mind. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but history would remember him by another name, Nero. Agrippina's early years as a young matron were quiet. Though danger always nipped at the hem of her stola, she kept close to court, carefully watching from the shadows as the emperors came and went. Tiberius died. Caligula, her own brother, rose to power, but madness followed. Caligula's reign was chaos, and Agrippina herself was eventually exiled, accused of plotting against him. Still, she survived. When Caligula was assassinated, and Claudius, her awkward, scholarly uncle, became emperor, Agrippina returned to the light. But this time she did not linger at the edge. This time she stepped into the center. She became empress. Yes, empress. She married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, an act shocking even by Roman standards. But Agrippina was not interested in sentiment. She was building something, not for herself, necessarily, but for her son Nero. She knew what needed to be done. First she removed rivals. Claudius had a son Britannicus by his previous wife, a natural heir. Agrippina quickly moved to sideline him, securing the emperor's adoption of Nero. Suddenly, her boy had a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. It rang like thunder across Rome. She strengthened alliances, brought influential men into Nero's orbit, and even had coins minted showing herself as equal to the emperor. Her image side by side with Claudius, unthinkable but true. And then Claudius died. How? Well, here is where the whispers begin. Some say he ate a plate of mushrooms and never rose again. The food of the gods, Romans called them. And some say Agrippina served them to him herself, laced with just enough poison to shift the balance of power. Nero, only 16, was declared emperor. Agrippina had done it. She had placed her son on the throne of the Roman Empire. But she had not planned to step back. In those early years, Agrippina ruled in all but name. Nero, young and impressionable, was surrounded by tutors and advisers, all chosen by his mother. She sat with the Senate. She oversaw correspondence. She met foreign ambassadors. For a brief, shining moment, Rome was guided by a woman's will. She wore royal purple. She signed decrees. She was the closest thing to an empress Rome had ever known. But the son she raised did not remain a boy for long. As Nero grew into his own power, he began to chafe under her control. He was wild, impulsive, drawn to theater and pleasure. He resented her presence, her reminders, her watchful eye. He desired freedom and feared her influence. And so, slowly, the boy turned against the woman who had built him. He stripped her of titles, removed her guards, sent her out of the palace. She did not go quietly, but she went. Still, she lingered. A few years later, Nero attempted something unthinkable. He plotted her murder. The stories of what happened next are almost surreal. He had a ship designed a gift, he claimed, and invited her aboard. The vessel had been rigged to collapse at sea, to send her drowning into the depths. But when it sank, Agrippina swam. Injured, furious, but alive. Rome buzzed with the story. Whispers travelled faster than oars, so Nero tried again. This time no theatrics, just a blade. In 59 C, assassins came to her villa. Some say she faced them calmly. Others claim she screamed and begged. One account, surely dramatized, says she bared her womb and cried out, "Strike here, for this bore Nero." Whatever the truth, she died. Her body was burned, her name condemned, and yet she was never forgotten. For centuries, Agrippina has been painted as a monster, a schemer, a poisoner, a mother who gave Rome one of its most infamous emperors. But beneath the legend is a deeper truth. She lived in a world where women were not meant to survive, let alone rule. She carved a path where none existed. She outlived emperors. She made one, and yes, perhaps she loved power too much. But can we blame her? She had been born into blood, raised in betrayal, surrounded by murderers and martyrs. And still she endured. She crafted her own myth, whether or not she meant to. So tonight, as your mind settles into stillness, picture her not as a villain, nor as a victim, but as a woman with fire in her heart. A woman who, in a world of men with swords, dared to hold a pen and sign history in her own hand. She may have been dangerous. She may have been ruthless, but above all, she was unforgettable. And in the slow hush of this sleepy Roman night, her footsteps still echo across marble floors and moonlit gardens, a mother, an empress, a ghost. Domitia Longina, the enigmatic and often overlooked wife of Emperor Domitian. The flicker of torchlight catches on marble once again, casting long shadows down a corridor you've never walked before. The scent of myrrh lingers in the air, faint, refined, like a memory just out of reach. Tonight, we enter the quiet, gilded world of a woman whose name has been mostly whispered, barely remembered. Yet she was there, always near the center, just behind the throne. Her name was Domitia Longina. She wasn't born into scandal. Not at first. In fact, her family had a long, proud history. The Domitia Hannibal, yes, the same family line as Emperor Nero, were among Rome's old aristocratic bloodlines. Her father, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, was a brilliant general, loved by his soldiers, feared by his enemies, and respected even by emperors. A rare combination. Domitia, his daughter, grew up among the smells of leather armor, letters from distant frontiers, and the soft clink of polished silver dining cups passed between commanders. She was raised to be proper, graceful, dignified, educated too. Domitia was not meant for the battlefield, but she was certainly trained for court, trained to speak in silences, to read the expression behind a senator's smile, and perhaps more than anything, she was taught to watch. Always to watch. At first, her life followed the usual script for women of noble rank. She was married young to a senator, Lucius Aelius Lamia. A fine match, comfortable, quiet, but Domitia, it seemed, was not meant for a quiet life, not for long, because then came Domitian. The younger son of Vespasian, Domitian had grown up in the shadow of his older brother, Titus. Where Titus was charismatic, Domitian was reserved, cold, some said, awkward, but burning inside him was ambition, deeply rooted, like a tree grown underground. And when he laid eyes on Domitia, the story goes, he wanted her. Immediately. It wasn't a polite courtship. Domitian pressured her to leave her husband, and she did. Whether by persuasion, promise, or something darker, Domitia divorced Lamia and married Domitian. It was a scandal, but once married to the imperial prince, she gained protection, privilege, and peril. Their relationship was strange, layered, and hard to pin down. Domitian adored her publicly. When he became emperor in 81 CE, he showered her with titles. Augusta, that meant she was more than empress, she was divine. He had coins minted with her image, statues raised in her honor. Her name was spoken alongside his in temples in prayers. They were not just ruler and consort. They were a unit, Domitian and Domitia. For a while it seemed they might even have a family dynasty. Domitia gave birth to a son, an heir. A moment of peace and purpose, but tragedy followed. The boy died young, just a child, and something inside Domitian seemed to shift forever. The emperor's mood grew darker, more suspicious. Rome was never kind to its emperors, but Domitian felt the weight of invisible knives behind every curtain. He purged the Senate, exiled philosophers, executed rivals, and Domitia remained by his side silent, elegant, watching. No one quite knew where she stood. Was she his supporter, his prisoner, his co-ruler? There are stories soft and flickering, like shadows on a wall. Some say she tried to curb his paranoia. Others say she encouraged it. A quiet word, a suggestion, a narrowed glance. She knew, as all Roman women in power knew, how to move things without seeming to touch them. The most dangerous acts were often the quietest. At one point, Domitian exiled her, publicly claiming adultery, accusing her of betraying the sanctity of their union. But this was Rome, and truth was as flexible as politics required. Whether the charges were real or simply the emperor's rage boiling over, no one can say. What matters is this: he brought her back. Not long after the exile, she returned to court, not diminished but restored. Her title was reinstated, her statues cleaned, her image once again graced imperial coins. Why? What had changed? Perhaps Domitian realized she was not just a wife, but a necessary mirror. There is something deeply Roman about the love between a dangerous man and a woman who understands him. Domitia seemed to know when to speak and when to remain silent. She wore her power like perfume, subtle, lingering, intoxicating. People may not have feared her outright, but they watched her closely because she was close to him. And he was unpredictable. Domitian ruled Rome like a man forever listening for footsteps. He turned the palace into a fortress. Mirrors hung on the walls so he could see behind him. His paranoia had teeth. Assassinations were frequent. Trials swirled like storms, and in this chaos Domitia never left. even when the air grew heavy with whispers, even when the swords grew too close, and then, finally, those whispers became real. In the year 96 C, a conspiracy formed. Palace officials, senators, even members of Domitian's household gathered in secret. They feared the emperor would soon execute them. Preemptively, they moved first. One morning, Domitian was murdered in his own chambers. Some say he was stabbed 7 times. Others claim he fought fiercely, but was overwhelmed. His reign ended not with ceremony, but with blood on marble. And where was Domitia? Here is where the story becomes cloudy. Some ancient sources suggest she knew of the plot, that she may even have helped it along, perhaps to save herself, perhaps because she'd had enough. Others say she wept bitterly, demanded justice, and honored him as a god after death. Both stories feel true, somehow. She did not disappear after his fall. Far from it. While many of Domitian's loyalists were purged, Domitia survived. Quietly, elegantly, the Senate tried to erase her husband from memory, his statues torn down, his name scratched from records. But she continued to live in the house they had shared, tended his memory, and called herself his widow. Decades later, when the historian Cassius Dio wrote of her, he called her a woman of character, not a seductress, not a schemer, not a poisoner or plotter, but a woman of character. That, perhaps, is what made Domitia Longina so dangerous. She did not need daggers. She did not shout. She simply remained. She endured emperors, exiles, the collapse of dynasties. She survived one of the most paranoid rulers Rome had ever known, not by opposing him, but by understanding him, by being indispensable, by being unreadable. There is something deeply unsettling, after all, about a woman who can live so close to madness and never lose herself. When you picture her now, let it be not in shadows, but in soft lamplight, sitting beside a window, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of wine, listening to the distant echo of soldiers changing shifts outside the palace gate. Her face calm, her eyes sharp, her heart perhaps long grown cold. Domitia Longina, daughter of a general, wife of an emperor, witness to the unraveling of Rome's golden mask. Not a goddess, not a victim, just a woman who knew how to survive the lion's den by learning how to live among lions. And now, as the fire beside you softens into a gentle glow, let her memory fade like the embers, slow, steady, quiet. A whisper in the history of Rome, but a whisper that still lingers. Faustina the Younger, the empress whose legacy remains shrouded in admiration, controversy, and seductive mystery. The night deepens around you, the crackle of fire softens, shadows lengthen, and slowly the marbled arches of the Roman Imperial palace rise around your imagination once again. Not the loud, bustling Rome of senators and soldiers, but the still, candlelit halls where secrets passed silently from one breath to another. In this hushed space, we meet a woman who wore beauty like a birthright, and whose name would become both legend and scandal, Faustina the Younger. She was born into power. Her father was Antoninus Pius, emperor of Rome, renowned for his calm governance, his philosophical mind, and his love for tradition. Her mother, Faustina the Elder, was equally venerated, a goddess in marble. So from her first breath, Faustina the Younger was wrapped in expectation. The empire watched her with reverent eyes. Her name already carried divine weight, Faustina, the cherished, the favored, the daughter of Rome. But Faustina's story would unfold far from the polite virtues her father's reign symbolized. She was married to Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, king, the stoic emperor who would spend most of his reign at war, scribbling meditations on duty and discipline as he watched the empire tremble at its edges, and while he sat in cold tents beneath distant skies, Faustina sat on Rome's golden throne. They were a pair unlike any other in Roman history, he the quiet soul, contemplating fate and virtue. She, the bold, glittering sun, hosting banquets, traveling with armies and birthing a dynasty. Yes, birthing. Because Faustina the Younger bore at least 13 children. Perhaps more, she was not just Empress. She was the mother of Rome literally. Her fertility was celebrated in coinage, art, and poetry. She represented a vision of feminine virtue, the perfect Roman matron, at least on the surface. But behind that gilded image, rumors stirred like a summer storm. Faustina was accused quietly, but persistently, of adultery, of taking lovers while her husband campaigned in distant lands. Some claimed she bedded gladiators. Others whispered of dalliances with senators, generals, even her own slaves. These tales passed from mouth to ear in Roman salons and shadowed corridors, became part of her legend. Was any of it true? It's impossible to say. Roman historians, especially those of later generations, loved to color empresses with scandal. And yet the rumors persisted, perhaps because they clashed so strongly with the ideal she represented. How could the wife of Marcus Aurelius, the wisest of emperors, the philosopher of Stoic restraint, be the object of such gossip? It made her irresistible to history, dangerous, enigmatic, and Marcus Aurelius. He never publicly condemned her. Quite the opposite, he praised her again and again. In his private writings, those sacred meditations not meant for anyone's eyes but his own. He speaks of her with deep affection. He trusted her, he needed her. He even brought her along on military campaigns, an unusual move for an empress, exposing her to the dirt and danger of frontier life. She was with him as he fought the Marcomannic Wars. She rode beside him, watched as winter descended on their tented encampments, walked among the wounded, encouraged the troops. They called her Mater Castrorum, mother of the camps. It was a title that had never been given to a Roman empress before. She wasn't just an imperial wife. She was a presence on the battlefield. And yet, as her influence grew, so too did the mutterings. Some said she had too much freedom, too much charm, too much power that wasn't entirely her own. There's a particularly haunting tale, almost certainly myth, of Faustina confessing an affair with a gladiator to her husband, then being advised by priests to purify herself by bathing in the gladiator's blood and consuming his heart. A grotesque fiction, likely, but one that reveals how threatened people were by her boldness, her visibility, her refusal to remain in the background. The more she stepped into the spotlight, the more Rome recoiled. And yet, despite it all, she endured. She kept her position, her titles, her husband's love, her children's inheritance. She ruled with a grace sharpened by strategy. Faustina was no fool. She understood the balance of perception and reality. She wore her scandals like perfume, never too strong but always noticeable. And in doing so, she became untouchable, a woman who could do what others only dreamed of, in an age when women were supposed to be symbols. Quiet, chaste, statuesque Faustina was alive, laughing, moving, dangerous not because she broke the rules, but because she redefined them. And then, in 175 C, as Marcus led another long campaign across the empire's restless frontiers, she died. The cause unclear. Some say it was sudden illness. Others whisper darker things, poison, heartbreak, a secret suicide. But Marcus Aurelius was devastated. His grief was real. He deified her almost immediately, declared her a goddess. Coins were struck with her image rising into the heavens. Temples were erected in her honor. Her death only magnified her legend. The Roman people mourned her publicly, though perhaps with a touch of confused relief. The Senate praised her virtue, even if their praise carried the flavor of obligation rather than honesty. And Marcus, he never remarried, never replaced her. She remained, in his writings and in his heart, the one constant in a life of war and loss. But Rome would remember Faustina with mixed emotions. For generations after, historians painted her as a warning. A woman too free, too charming, too willing to wield feminine power in a masculine world. She was accused of everything from treason to lust. Even her own son, Commodus, who would become emperor after Marcus, was seen as a product of her supposed moral failure. The logic went, if Commodus was cruel, mad, corrupt, it must have been Faustina's influence, as if one woman's scandalous passions could explain an empire's unraveling. But perhaps it's more honest to see Faustina not as a villain or a goddess, but as something far more real. A woman trying to breathe in a suffocating age. A woman who lived in a golden cage, but chose, again and again, to rattle its bars. She dared to be visible when invisibility was safety. She dared to live boldly when caution was worshipped. She dared to move through the empire not just as a wife or a mother, but as a force. And that, more than the rumors, more than the myths, is what made her dangerous. She was not meant to rule, but she did quietly, effectively, with charm and steel hidden beneath silk. As your eyes begin to close and the fire beside you softens to a final glow, let Faustina drift into your dreams not as the Empress of scandal, but as the Empress of survival. A woman who bore the weight of Rome, its scrutiny, its hypocrisy, and its aching admiration, and never once collapsed under it. She remains even now, somewhere between the stars and the shadows, a goddess in name, a woman in truth. And so, as the silence of the Imperial palace settles once again, remember that sometimes the most dangerous women in history were not those who broke the rules, but those who smiled, bowed, and quietly rewrote them. Sleep now. The Empress fades. Julia Domna, let your mind ease into stillness now, like the hush that settles over an ancient library at dusk. You may hear faint echoes of sandals on marble, the soft rustle of parchment, the trickle of a fountain hidden deep in a Roman courtyard. In this half-lit space, we begin to follow the life of a woman who walked with philosophers, commanded legions, and carried the fate of an empire on her shoulders, all while the world around her slowly unraveled. Her name was Julia Domna. To many, she was a mystery. To others, she was the empire's mind. She was born not in Rome, but in Syria, in the city of Emesa, where the desert wind met temple bells and where religion flowed like wine everywhere and always. Her father, a high priest of the sun god Elegable, ruled not through politics, but through worship. And it was from that sacred place that Julia stepped into the wider Roman world, wrapped in incense and learning, her eyes already trained on stars far beyond the desert sky. She was intelligent, dazzlingly so. Her education was rare, her curiosity endless. She spoke philosophy as easily as other women spoke gossip, and when she caught the eye of Septimius Severus, a rising Roman general of African heritage, her fate was sealed. They married not out of romance, but calculation, yet in time, perhaps, found both. Severus believed in astrology, and Julia's horoscope, it was said, promised she would marry a king. That alone made her desirable in a world where fate still whispered through stars. But Severus saw more than prophecy in her. He saw strength. He saw a mind that would not buckle beneath crowns or crumble in palace intrigue. He saw a partner, not a puppet. And when he rose to claim the purple robes of empire, she stood beside him, a foreigner on Rome's most glittering stage. Julia's reign began not with quiet but with chaos. Rome was crumbling under civil war. Rival emperors tore at each other, provinces split their loyalties, and soldiers mutinied over every promise made or broken. And in the middle of it all, as legions clashed and rivers ran red, Julia Domna became empress, not just in title, in spirit, in command. As Severus fought across the frontiers, she governed Rome. She convened philosophers in her court, men who once dismissed women as footnotes. She oversaw correspondence, resolved petitions, even issued directives. When her husband traveled, she rode with him, even across the frozen frontiers of Britain. She became known as Mater Castorum, like Faustina before her, mother of the camps. But Julia was no figurehead. She wasn't merely beloved by the soldiers. She spoke their language, she listened, and more than that, she made decisions that mattered. But power, as always, came at a price. She had 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, brothers in blood, rivals in soul. When Septimius Severus died in 211 C, his dying wish was simple, that his sons rule together, sharing power, united by duty. But the empire was not made for sharing, and neither were the brothers. Julia tried. She pleaded, negotiated, stood between them like a statue come to life, trying to cool the fire that flared between their stares. But it was no use. Within months, Caracalla murdered Geta, staining the palace floor with his brother's blood. He did it in their mother's arms, literally. Julia held Geta in her embrace as soldiers burst into the room. As swords pierced flesh, as silence followed, that moment, unspeakable, unthinkable, became the turning point in her life. From then on, Julia Domna lived in a strange twilight. Caracalla, now sole emperor, descended into paranoia and cruelty. He was feared more than loved, admired for his ruthlessness, hated for his instability, and behind him, always behind him, was his mother, veiled, serene, unreadable. Did she grieve? Undoubtedly. Did she mourn Geta? In silence, but she remained. She remained because Rome needed continuity. Because Caracalla, for all his pride, trusted no one but her. She advised him, she steadied him, she smoothed the bloody edges of his reign with a voice barely above a whisper. And again she ruled without title, without throne, but with the quiet inevitability of moonlight. It was during this period that Julia's true power began to show itself. She established one of the most learned courts in Roman history. Her salons gathered thinkers from across the known world, Greek philosophers, Egyptian scholars, Persian mystics. They debated ethics, law, medicine, and fate, while beyond the palace gates the empire trembled. In many ways, she was building a sanctuary, not of stone, but of thought. She funded schools, supported writers, commissioned works of philosophy. Even the famous physician Galen found patronage in her household. In the eye of an imperial storm, Julia made space for the mind. And yet the storm could not be ignored. Caracalla's reign spun ever darker. He executed senators on whim. He imposed heavy taxes. He slaughtered entire populations in vengeful bursts of rage. Julia watched as the son she had protected, and perhaps in ways created, became a creature Rome feared. But she stayed because what else could she do? He was her son. He was her emperor. He was her grief. In 217 C, the spiral ended abruptly. Caracalla was assassinated while traveling to a temple in Mesopotamia. A man named Macrinus, a once loyal officer, seized the throne, and now Julia Domna faced a choice: return to Rome and fade into ceremonial silence, or resist. She chose resistance. She had allies still. She had wisdom. She had the people's memory. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had one last spark of ambition. But Macrinus was swift. He ordered Julia Domna to leave the court, to disappear, to become silent. She refused. And then, when illness, likely cancer, began to waste her from within, she made a decision worthy of a tragic heroine. She refused food. She allowed death to come, not by blade or poison or dagger in the dark, but by sheer will. The Empress, who had held the Roman Empire together through war, blood, and philosophy, simply faded. Her death sent shockwaves through the East. Her name was whispered with reverence, but Rome, ever hungry for new rulers, ever forgetful, moved on. And yet her story was not over. Her sister's family, the Severan dynasty, would rise again. Julia's great nephew Elagabalus would become emperor and bring with him chaos that would make Caracalla seem tame. But that is a story for another night. Tonight we leave Julia Domna as she should be remembered, not in sorrow, but in dignity. A woman who governed empires without titles, who walked through fire and kept her poise, who lost a son in her arms and still stood up the next day. A woman of books, of silence, of unbearable strength. She was dangerous not because she sought war, but because she understood peace. Not because she ruled loudly, but because she whispered so well that the empire leaned in to listen. So as your thoughts drift now, softened by shadows and memory, let her remain with you, not as marble, not as myth, but as breath. A woman who saw the empire crack and still poured light into its fractures. The fire dims, the philosophers fall quiet, and Julia Domna disappears into the smoke. Julia Soemias, the Empress, mother of Elagabalus, architect of a scandalous rise, and silent architect of her own fall. Let the flicker of your imagination cast long shadows now. The fire crackles gently, warming the corners of a quiet room. Somewhere in the distant past, a perfumed breeze winds through marble pillars. Silken sandals click across mosaic floors, and through the silence comes a whisper, a name half forgotten, half feared, Julia Soemias. She wasn't born into greatness. Not exactly, but she was born into a family that knew how to find it. The Syrian sun blazed over her childhood. Her mother was Julia Misa, sister to the great Julia Domna, both daughters of a powerful priest of the sun god Elagabal. Theirs was a world of incense and influence, of ritual and rare ambition. From her earliest days, Soemias was taught not to wait for power, but to create it, and so she did. As the Severan dynasty tottered after the death of her cousin Caracalla and the suicide of her aunt Julia Domna, Soemias and her mother retreated not in defeat, but in calculation. Far from Rome, in Emesa, they watched the empire slip through the fingers of unworthy men, and in the stillness they made plans. They had something others didn't. They had a boy. Soemia's son was named Varius Avitus Bassianus, but history remembers him as Elagabalus, after the eastern sun god he served. A curious child, beautiful, wild, draped in divine mystery, a high priest at 14, and with Soemia's and Misa's ambition, soon to be an emperor. It wasn't a rebellion that brought him to the throne. Not exactly. It was theatre, careful whispers, carefully placed gold, letters sent to legionaries reminding them of their loyalty to the Severan name, coins minted with familiar faces, the illusion of destiny, and it worked. The Emperor Macrinus, cold, bureaucratic, unwanted, was overthrown. And suddenly Rome had a new ruler, not a soldier, not a senator, a child, but the child was a god, priest. The child was a symbol, and behind that child stood Julia Soemias. She had played her part well. The campaign was hers. The vision hers. It was Soemias who had stood before soldiers and declared her son the rightful heir. Soemias who had carried the torch of the Severans through blood and smoke. And when Elagabalus was welcomed into Rome in 219 CE, it was Soemias who stepped into the palace as de facto empress. But Rome had not yet seen what was coming. This was not an ordinary reign. This was not a whisper of power, as with Julia Domna. This was spectacle. Elagabalus was no mere ruler. He was a living god, at least in his own mind, and Soemias encouraged it. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she simply needed him to believe it. In either case, she stood at his side as he made his reign a pageant of divine drama. He wore robes of gold and purple. He danced in temples to the rhythm of cymbals. He married Vestal virgins, violated sacred laws, and then married again to men, to statues, to gods. And through it all, Julia Soemias remained nearby, radiant and calm. As courtiers gossiped, as senators gnashed their teeth in disbelief, she smiled. Why? Because for the first time, a woman, not behind the scenes, but clearly, unmistakably, held the strings. She was not just a mother, she was Augusta, officially honored. She held the title of Mother of the Emperor, but acted more like the co-emperor of Rome. She issued edicts, received ambassadors, sat in the Senate chamber. She even attended military councils. Rome had never seen anything like it. Some were horrified, others fascinated, but even as the crowds watched the boy, God with a mixture of awe and confusion, it was Soemias they feared, because she had made him, and because he listened only to her. In many ways she had become what no Roman woman was ever allowed to be: openly powerful. publicly dominant, unapologetically in charge. There were no veils in her rule, no quiet corners or soft-spoken influence. She was power itself, perfumed, jeweled, enthroned, and Rome would not forgive her for it. The scandals escalated. Elagabalus tried to replace Jupiter, the chief Roman god, with the eastern deity Elagabal. He built an enormous temple on the Palatine Hill, the Elagabalium, and forced Rome to worship the black stone of his god. He declared that all religions would be folded into this new sun cult. The old gods, he said, were subordinate. To the devout Roman heart, this was not just heresy. It was treason, and through it all, Julia Soaemias nodded, advised, smoothed over the worst offences, or perhaps encouraged them. It's hard to know. Roman historians, men with trembling quills and bruised egos, painted her as an Eastern seductress, a corrupter of Roman virtue. They accused her of magic, of lust, of manipulating her own son's bizarre appetites. Whether these stories were true or simply smear campaigns, we cannot say. But we know this: the tension grew, the Senate began to whisper, the people began to mock, the Praetorian Guard began to watch. And somewhere in the shadows, Julia Maesa, Soaemias' own mother, the old architect of the dynasty, began to regret her creation. Maesa had another grandson, a quieter boy, polite, Roman in sensibility. His name was Severus Alexander. And so, in the dark corners of the palace, power began to shift. The people were weary of madness. The army, humiliated by their emperor's parades and provocations, longed for stability. The boy, priest, once a spectacle, had become a liability. And his mother, his elegant, commanding mother, had become dangerous. The end came quietly. The year was 222 C. Elagabalus, just 18 years old, sensed the tide turning. He begged the Praetorian Guard to swear loyalty. He promised gifts. He paraded his cousin Alexander around like a trophy. But it was too late. The Guard had already chosen. They turned on him, and on his mother, as Julia Soaemias tried to shield her son, perhaps remembering how her Aunt Julia Domna once cradled her dying child. Swords rose. No trial, no speeches, no mercy. She was stabbed to death alongside her son in the very barracks where they had once been worshipped. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mocked, mutilated, cast into the Tiber. The sun cult was abolished. Her name stricken from records, but history has a strange way of surviving the censors. And so here we are, centuries later, remembering her. A woman who defied every Roman rule, who wielded power without apology, who made an emperor and unmade herself in the process. Was she dangerous? Yes, but not for the reasons history says, not because she plotted murders or poisoned enemies, but because she refused to stay in the shadows, because she dared to shape the empire with her own hands, because she raised a storm and believed she could guide it. And maybe, for a time, she did. Now, as you lay still, resting gently in the hush of night, let her fade once more, not into disgrace, but into something softer. A memory, a caution, a story whispered between the lines. Julia Soaemias, mother of the sun god, flame of her dynasty, and empress in a world that had no room for her kind. Sleep now, let the palace fall silent again. The torches burn low, and her footsteps, scandalous, silken, unforgettable, fade softly into the past. Julia Mamaea, mother of Emperor Severus Alexander, she was revered, feared, and ultimately blamed for leading her son and the empire toward ruin. The halls were quiet now. The great fires of the Severan dynasty had flickered and dimmed. The mad boy, priest Elagabalus, was gone, dragged through the streets like a parody of power. But Rome was tired of madness. It wanted order, civility, tradition, and into that weary space stepped a woman with poise, grace, and iron. Julia Mamaea. If you close your eyes, you might imagine her, wrapped in the finest silks of the East, her hair sculpted in the latest Roman fashion, and behind her eyes calculation. But not the wild fire of Soaemias, not the scandal of Cleopatra or the venom of Fulvia. Mamaea was cold flame, controlled, still, and dangerously clever. She was the daughter of Julia Misa, yes, that Misa, the matriarch who had shaped a dynasty out of nothing but Eastern gold, political marriages, and raw will. Mamaea had watched her sister Soemias rise beside Elagabalus and fall beside him too. She had seen firsthand how spectacle could undo even the most carefully laid plans. So Mamaea took a different path, a quieter path. She would not dress herself in godhood or parade sacred stones. She would not push her son into absurd marriages or ceremonies. She would give Rome what it claimed to want, a sober emperor. A man of sense, law, dignity. His name was Severus Alexander, though it hadn't always been. He was her son raised in the shadow of madness, polished like a coin before presentation. Mamaea ensured that when Elagabalus stumbled, the army would beg for someone better, and they did. Alexander was young, just 14 when the purple was draped around him, a child, emperor, yes, but calm, obedient, and well-mannered. He listened, he deferred, he smiled at the Senate, and standing behind him, nearly invisible, was Julia Mamaea. Not loud, not scandalous, not indulgent. She was careful. She had learned the lessons her sister had not. Rome must never see you rule. It must believe it has given you power. So she ruled in whispers. She ruled through tutors, advisers, and reforms. She appointed jurists and philosophers to guide her son. She surrounded him with men of principle. She encouraged restraint, diplomacy, prudence, and for a time it worked. Rome exhaled, the provinces calmed, the temples were cleansed of Elagabal's foreign rites. Jupiter returned to his rightful place. The Senate applauded. Mamaea was hailed as Mater Augusti, mother of the emperor, and later Mater Senatus et Patrii, mother of the Senate and the fatherland. A title no woman had ever claimed before, but with honor comes envy. Whispers grew that the emperor was not truly ruling, that his mother held the reins, that she meddled in every matter, no matter how small. And to some extent it was true. She vetted appointments, she supervised military command, she even decided whom her son could marry and when. She was afraid, you see, not of power, but of what it could do to him. She had seen Elagabalus descend into chaos and drag Soemias with him. She would not let Alexander make the same mistakes. She watched every move, questioned every motive. And the more power she held, the more isolated they became. It began with the court. Officials resented her. Generals feared her scrutiny. Even Alexander himself began to bristle, though gently. He was obedient, but he was also a man, or growing into one, and a man, even an emperor, does not like to feel his life bound by a mother's hand. But Mamaea would not loosen her grip, not for him, not for Rome, and certainly not for the legions, for it was in the army where her name curdled from respect into disdain. She did not understand soldiers, or perhaps she did and simply did not care for their ways. She cut their luxuries, demanded discipline, denied rewards she saw as excessive, and when Rome's enemies grew bold, on the Persian frontier and later along the Rhine, she treated war as a game of coins and treaties. She sent money instead of force, bribes instead of battle. It was not enough. The Persians rose under the new Sassanid king Ardashir and invaded Mesopotamia. The legions marched, and Julia Mamaea marched with them. Yes, with them. She traveled in the emperor's camp, directed policy, advised strategy. Even military decisions, it was said, passed through her. Imagine the fury of the general's men who had bled for the empire, taking orders from a woman behind a curtain. The campaign dragged. The Persians were not cowed. The soldiers were hungry, angry, tired of delay. And tired of her, then came the northern frontier. The Germanic tribes were pushing into Roman lands along the Rhine. Severus Alexander, now nearly a man, was sent to address the crisis, and again Julia Mamaea came with him. The soldiers expected glory. What they got was negotiation. bribes, peace offerings. Mamaea had arranged everything. There would be no heroic charges, no speeches before battle, only careful diplomacy. The legions snapped. What had begun as grumbling turned to open mutiny. The soldiers demanded a true leader, a general of their own. They turned to Maximinus Thrax, a man of enormous stature and common birth. A soldier's soldier, he had little education, no nobility, but he had blood on his hands and strength in his arms. They declared him emperor. Alexander and Mamaea, once beloved by Rome, now rejected by their own army, were caught in the camp. There was no escape. She saw it coming, perhaps, the shifting glances, the sudden silence, the way soldiers no longer bowed. She must have known. There are no detailed records of their final moments. But we know this. The army stormed the imperial tent, and there, beside her son, the woman who had ruled Rome for over a decade was cut down. No trial, no farewell. Just silence. Her body, like her sisters before her, was discarded. Her titles revoked, her memory tarnished. Some said she was too proud, too meddling, too imperial. But others, even in whispers, admitted she had given Rome peace for as long as she could. What does it mean to be dangerous, to command an army, to poison a rival, to scheme from shadows, or to guide a boy through the deadly machinery of empire, keeping him alive year after year, even as vultures circled? Julia Mamaea was not dangerous in the way history likes to dramatize. She was not seductive or theatrical. She wore no veils. She lit no incense. She ruled calmly, competently, fearlessly, and in doing so, became everything Roman society feared in a woman. Visible, commanding, essential, she was not loved, but she was obeyed until she wasn't, and when that moment came, her enemies did not debate her legacy or weigh her merits. They silenced her brutally, efficiently, as she might have done had the roles been reversed. Tonight, as the embers fade and your breath softens with sleep, imagine her, seated beside her son, her eyes tired but unflinching. A woman who had given everything to protect what she had built. A mother, an empress, a strategist. And a cautionary tale. Her story is not gilded in romance or riddled with scandal. It is one of restraint, control, and ultimately quiet tragedy. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the world of swords and whispers fall away. The cold winds of the Rhine are distant now. The campfires of the Legion have dimmed, and Julia Mamaea, for all her danger, fades gently into the shadows of Rome. Julia Domna, the scent of parchment, the rustle of silk, the low murmur of voices quoting Aristotle under moonlight. This was not the Rome of roaring crowds or clashing blades, not tonight. This was a quieter world, a palace of scrolls and soft candlelight, where strategy was wrapped in smiles and power moved like perfume, unseen but impossible to ignore. And in the center of it all sat Julia Domna, to meet her gaze, if you could, in this imagined moment, would be to feel both warmth and weight. Her eyes, dark as ink and calm as water, did not flinch. They had watched wars rise and emperors fall. They had witnessed triumph, betrayal, and the slow disintegration of family in the name of empire. She was no ordinary empress, no ornamental figure draped in jewels and paraded before crowds. Julia Domna ruled with her mind, with her pen, and with her silence. Born in Emesa, in Syria, she came from a dynasty of priests, kings guardians of the sun god Elagabal. Her family was powerful, yes, but not Roman. She was foreign, Eastern, a philosopher's daughter, and in a world where women were expected to serve or seduce, she did something very different. She thought, and Rome noticed, so did Septimius Severus, the North African general who would one day wear the purple. When he sought a wife, he did not look for a beauty alone, though Julia Domna had that in plenty. He consulted astrologers. They told him to marry a woman who would become queen of the world. He chose Julia, and she became exactly that. When Septimius seized power during Rome's many civil wars, Julia Domna was by his side, not behind him. Beside him, she advised him, travelled with him on campaign, slept in tents with him among the soldiers. Her presence calmed provinces, her intellect commanded respect, and her smile, always a little knowing, masked deeper currents. She was given a title no woman had held before, Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camp. The legions adored her not for softness, but for her steel wrapped in velvet. She paid their wages, advised their generals, and never flinched when marching toward danger. In Rome, she presided over a court of philosophers. Rhetoricians, poets, the best minds of the empire came to her salon, not just to flatter, but to learn. It was said she could quote Plato and dissect Stoicism before breakfast. She read Greek as easily as Latin, and debated metaphysics while weaving plots of state. She had power not because her husband gave it to her, but because she earned it. She ruled the empire as co-equal with Severus. When he rode off to war, she governed. When he returned, he listened to her counsel. They were a match of minds, not just crowns. But what happens to a brilliant woman when the world around her begins to crumble? When her husband, her anchor, is no longer there? That was the question that would define the second half of her life. Septimius Severus died in Britain, far from Rome, his body wrapped in imperial purple and Roman dust. His final words to his sons were strange. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. He left the empire to Caracalla and Geta, their sons. Julia Domna's sons, brothers, yes, but oil and water. She tried to hold them together. She truly did. She arranged joint appearances, oversaw the Senate to ensure fair treatment, balanced their tempers with care, like a stateswoman pouring just enough oil on a fire to keep it warm, not wild. But jealousy is a fierce and slippery thing. Caracalla, older, bolder, impatient, saw Geta as a threat. And within the year he solved the problem his way. He murdered his brother in their mother's arms. Yes, Geta was stabbed in Julia's presence inside a room they believed was safe. Blood spilled on her robe. She screamed, they said, or maybe she didn't. Maybe she just sat still, frozen, as her younger son's life slipped from his body and stained the marble. From that moment on, Julia Domna lived in silence. She did not rebel, did not flee. She stayed by Caracalla's side. Imagine the strength that must have taken to walk beside your child's killer, when that killer is your other child. And Caracalla was cruel, paranoid, unhinged. He had inherited none of his father's wisdom and all of his rage. He waged war across the East, burned bridges with the Senate, and indulged in dreams of Alexander the Great. He dragged Julia Domna across the empire as he campaigned. She was still Mater Castrorum, but her face grew tired, her gaze distant. She was older now, wiser still, and wounded. Then came the letter. A quiet rumor passed from camp to camp, city to city. Caracalla had been assassinated, stabbed by a disgruntled soldier during a roadside stop. The emperor was dead. Julia Domna, sitting alone in Antioch, now held a strange power again. Imperial widow, mother of dead emperors. A woman who had survived everything, and still she held court. She organized the next steps. She had no illusions about ruling herself. Rome would never allow it, but she might shape the succession. Help bring the empire back to balance. But fate, ever cruel, had other plans. She received another letter from the new Emperor Macrinus, once a prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He had no noble blood, no claim to the throne, only a blade and ambition. He ordered Julia Domna to leave Antioch and return to Rome. He wanted her gone. She refused. Her health was failing, her lungs diseased, perhaps her spirit too. There are whispers, soft ones, almost hidden in dusty scrolls, that she chose to die, that she starved herself, that with dignity she withdrew from the world she had ruled for decades. Not with a cry, but with a breath, and just like that, she was gone. Julia Domna, the philosopher Empress, the Syrian queen of Rome. the woman who stood beside a general and shaped an empire with her words more than her sword. They buried her quietly, far from the thrones she once helped steady. History did not celebrate her as it should. It rarely does for women like her. Too smart, too powerful, too inconvenient. But here, tonight, in this soft and flickering moment, we remember her. Not with fanfare, not with stone statues, but with stillness. She reminds us that true power is often invisible, that empires are not just built by warriors and tyrants, but by women who write, who think, who lead from within. That danger comes not always from daggers, but from minds sharp enough to change the course of history without lifting a finger. So sleep now, let her court fade into shadows, let the scrolls return to their shelves, let Julia Domna return to the dream of Rome she held so dearly, elegant, wise, and just slightly tragic. And know that in the grand tapestry of history, some of the brightest threads belong to women like her, woven quietly, but unbreakably, into the very fabric of an empire. Julia Misa, the woman who overthrew emperors and installed 2 of her grandsons as rulers of Rome, all from the shadows. The night settles gently over the marble colonnades of ancient Rome. The statues, once gleaming in the sun, now stand ghost, like beneath moonlight. And while the city sleeps, behind velvet curtains and golden doors, someone is plotting. Not a senator, not a general, but a grandmother. Her name was Julia Misa, and she was far more dangerous than anyone guessed. If you've heard of her grandsons Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, then you've already seen the ripples of her influence. But Julia Misa herself, she didn't march in parades or command legions with a raised fist. No, her weapons were whispers, wealth, and the keen understanding of human weakness. To understand her story, we must first return to the aftermath of tragedy. Julia Misa was the sister of Julia Domna, the philosopher Empress you just met. When Julia Domna died, perhaps by her own hand, her family was stripped of power. Her remaining relatives, seen as dangerous relics of the Severan dynasty, were quietly exiled from the palaces of Rome to the dusty edges of the empire. Julia Misa returned to her native city of Emesa in what is now Syria. She was older than Silva, haired, commanding, and quietly smoldering with ambition. She could have lived out her life as a matriarch among incense and temples, far from Rome's deadly politics. But her blood boiled with dynastic memory. She had tasted power. She had seen her sister rule the world. And she had grandsons, too, to be exact, both still boys, one with soft, effeminate features and wild devotion to the eastern sun god, Elagabal. The other, quiet, thoughtful, pliable. One would become a scandal. The other, an emperor. Julia Misa watched, waited, and began to plan. Rome, at that moment, was in disarray. The Emperor Macrinus, who had taken the throne after Caracalla's assassination, was an outsider. A usurper, he had no noble blood, no claim to the Severan name, and little love from the army. Julia Misa saw her opportunity. She knew that loyalty in Rome often came at a price, not with love, but with gold, and she had gold. Vast sums, tucked away from her years at court, hidden in silks and sealed in caravans. She began to spread rumors among the Roman legions stationed in the east. Little stories, whispers, that her grandson, Elagabalus, was not just a priest, not just her heir, but the secret son of Caracalla. A Severan by blood, a rightful emperor. It wasn't true, of course, or if it was, no one could prove it. But in Rome, truth mattered less than timing. The soldiers listened, and Julia Misa sent them bribes. Gifts promise after promise. She promised her grandson would be generous, that the Severan age would return, that glory and gold would flow like rivers. And then, one morning in 218 CE, the legions in Syria turned on Macrinus. They proclaimed Elagabalus emperor. The boy was just 14. He stood awkwardly before them in his high priest robes, shining with gold and Eastern jewels, face painted for ritual, lips stained with incense and smoke. The image was strange, Roman, otherworldly, but the army didn't care. They wanted power. They wanted Severan gold. They wanted Julia Mesa's promise of imperial continuity. Macrinus tried to rally, tried to crush the revolt, but the soldiers turned faster than he expected. And in the space of a few brutal weeks, Julia Mesa's plan worked. Macrinus was dead, her grandson was emperor, and she had never lifted a sword. She had simply waited and chosen her moment. But Julia Mesa was not finished. She followed Elagabalus back to Rome, seated beside him like an empress reborn. She wore her jewels again. Her robes returned to imperial purple. Her home, once distant, was now the beating heart of power. And yet even she could not control what happened next. For Elagabalus was not like other emperors. He brought with him the cult of his eastern god, Elagabal. He forced Roman senators to watch him perform sacred rituals foreign to their eyes, sacrifices under blazing sun, dances beneath meteorite stones. He married a vestal virgin, breaking the sacred law of Rome. He declared himself both god and goddess, wore makeup in public, and was said to have asked physicians if they could perform surgery to make him a woman. He was bold, beautiful, and utterly destabilizing. Rome, steeped in tradition and patriarchal fear, was scandalized. Julia Mesa, ever the political chess master, saw it coming. She realized her mistake. Elagabalus was too alien, too flamboyant, too uncontrollable. And more dangerously, he alienated the army, especially the Praetorian Guard, Rome's brutal enforcers. So quietly she began to favor another. Her second grandson, Severus Alexander, 15 years old, polished, studious, silent, everything Elagabalus was not. She persuaded Elagabalus, still trusting his grandmother, that naming Alexander as his heir would calm the Senate. Soothe the soldiers, give Rome some sense of stability, he agreed. Julia Mesa smiled and waited again. The Praetorians, as she expected, shifted their loyalty to Alexander almost immediately. In 222 they turned on Elagabalus. He was seized along with his mother Julia Soemias, Julia Mesa's daughter. Both were murdered in the palace. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber. Julia Mesa had sacrificed her own grandchild and her own daughter to preserve the dynasty. She did not weep publicly, did not protest. She simply shifted her gaze. Severus Alexander became emperor, and Julia Mesa ruled through him. In many ways, this was the climax of her genius. She had restored the Severan line twice. She had outwitted usurpers, generals, and scandal. She had pulled the strings from behind silk veils, moving emperors like chess pieces on a board only she could see. She acted through women, her sister, her daughters, her grandsons, and never once needed to sit on a throne herself. She was dangerous, yes, but not because she killed, because she chose who lived. Eventually, she faded from history. The records do not tell us how she died or when, but we imagine her, perhaps, in a quiet courtyard in Rome, sipping wine as the ivy climbs the walls, the din of politics murmuring like distant thunder. She had done what no woman had done before her, and few would do after. Tonight, we remember Julia Mesa not with fear, but fascination. She was not evil. She was clever. She saw the game of power not as one for men and swords, but for whispers, influence, and gold coins placed in the right hands at the right time. She reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest, but the one smiling quietly in the corner, waiting, watching, and ready. So, as the night deepens and the fire crackles softly beside your pillow, let us leave Julia Mesa in her palace of shadows. Let the curtains fall, the footsteps fade, the empire continue, but remember her, a grandmother, a strategist, a queen of no crown who ruled Rome from behind the veil. Faustina the Younger, a Roman empress whose beauty, ambition, and swirling rumors placed her among the most talked about women in Imperial Rome. The marble hallways of the Roman Imperial Palace never stayed quiet for long. They whispered with the voices of slaves and scribes, echoed with the sandals of senators, and occasionally carried something far more dangerous than any sword or spear, a rumor. And no one in Rome drew more rumors than Faustina the Younger. She was born into legacy, the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, and the wife of the man who would later be known as the great philosopher, Emperor Marcus Aurelius. From the beginning, she was surrounded by duty, titles, and expectations. She wasn't just an empress. She was, for a time, the most visible woman in the empire, and yet behind her gilded image lived a woman who both fascinated and frightened her contemporaries. To understand Faustina is to look beyond marble busts and bronze coins, because those images, elegant, serene, perfectly composed, only show us the surface. They don't reveal the debates she stirred in the Senate, the whispers that followed her through the marketplace, or the controversies that haunted her for centuries. She was said to be beautiful beyond compare, and yet her name became synonymous with scandal. She was honored with the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, for accompanying her husband on military campaigns, a title no other empress before her had received. But in Rome, a woman's presence near the army, especially a woman as glamorous and bold as Faustina, was like throwing oil on flame. The soldiers whispered that she was not just the emperor's wife, but something else entirely. Some said she held private audiences with generals in her tent, that she flirted with centurions, that she used her presence not for comfort, but for control. And those whispers only grew louder. By the time Marcus Aurelius became emperor in 161 CE, Faustina had already given birth to 12 children, an astonishing number even by Roman standards. Many of them died young, as was tragically common, but among them was a boy who would grow into one of Rome's most controversial rulers, Commodus. Yes, that Commodus, the erratic gladiator, loving emperor immortalized in modern films, and with him came one of the most enduring and scandalous rumors about Faustina. Some said Commodus was not Marcus Aurelius's son at all. They claimed Faustina had taken a lover, a gladiator, and that Commodus was born of that union. The story went further. It whispered that Marcus Aurelius, upon hearing of the affair, was grief-stricken, that he consulted his philosophers, that he considered death or exile or even divine punishment, but no action was taken. Why? Perhaps because he loved her, or perhaps because Faustina had woven herself so deeply into the machinery of power that removing her would have caused more damage than letting her remain. This story, probably a fabrication, has survived for centuries, not because it was proven, but because it was believable. Because Faustina had become, in the minds of many Romans, too powerful, too present, and too bold to be trusted. She rode with the army. She made political decisions when Marcus was away. She was seen in public alone more often than any empress before her. Political are agile marriages predictability, and used her vast wealth to fund charities and building projects. And yet all of this was overshadowed by one thing, her gender. A woman in Rome could be praised only up to a point. Too virtuous, and she was called a goddess. Too visible, and she became dangerous. Faustina straddled that line with confidence. She did not retreat into the shadows as other imperial women had. She did not hide behind her husband's titles. She stood beside him, and at times even in front of him, and this unnerved people. When she died, perhaps suddenly, while traveling with Marcus Aurelius in the east, the emperor was devastated. He had statues built in her honor. He had coins minted bearing her face with the inscription Diva Faustina, the deified Faustina. He named a town after her, Faustinopolis, but still, the rumors followed her into the afterlife. Some later Roman historians, especially those of the more moralistic or patriarchal variety, painted Faustina as a woman of excessive lust, unrestrained ambition, and dangerous influence. They described her as scheming behind the scenes, undermining Marcus Aurelius's Stoic philosophy with her own worldly appetites. They blamed her for Commodus's cruelty, saying it was her blood, not Marcus's, that flowed in his veins. Whether any of it was true doesn't really matter. What matters is what it tells us about Rome, because Rome was afraid of women like Faustina, women who were not satisfied with titles and jewels, women who walked the edge of power and touched it with bare hands, women who had the emperor's ear and the soldier's attention. She had done things no other empress had done. She had defied expectations, and history, written mostly by men, retaliated. But in her lifetime, the people of Rome, especially the soldiers, adored her. They chanted her name in the camps. They carved her face into rings and amulets. They cheered when she appeared on balconies, often holding one of her many children in her arms like a living symbol of continuity. And perhaps that's why she was so dangerous, because she commanded love, and love is harder to control than fear. Imagine her now in your mind's eye, riding through the Syrian desert on horseback, her hair tied back against the wind, bronze armor glinting beneath royal silk. She's not soft or passive. She's calculating, alert, watching, not with cruelty but with intention. She knows that her husband depends on her. She knows the soldiers trust her, and she knows perhaps better than anyone that a woman does not have to be empress to rule like one. As we let the night deepen, as the fireplace crackles low and your breath slows into stillness, let Faustina remain with us, not as a caricature or a scandal, but as something more ancient and more real, a woman shaped by power, feared for her freedom, and remembered not because she followed the rules, but because she rewrote them. Julia Domna, the desert winds of Syria, had once brushed against her skin, before the cold marbles of Rome ever felt her step. Julia Domna was born in the east, in Emesa, into a priestly family that traced its lineage back to the sun god Elagabal. The stars above the sands had watched her grow, and perhaps whispered their secrets into her mind, because there was something about Julia that was always quietly destined. When she was young, she wasn't just known for beauty, though Roman historians were quick to remind us of her elegant brow, her serene gaze, the way she moved like a marble statue brought to life. What set her apart was her intellect. She read deeply. She spoke with authority. She understood not only the domestic expectations of Roman womanhood, but the intricate lacework of philosophy, medicine, and statecraft. And that is where her danger began. She was married off to a rising general named Septimius Severus, a soldier of ambition, not of noble birth, but with eyes set firmly on Rome's throne. Some say he chose her not just for her status or her family's connections in the East, but because astrologers had told him that she would bear an emperor. He was right. In time, she would become the mother of Caracalla and Geta, and the wife of an emperor. But long before that, she began learning what true power tasted like. When Severus rose to become Emperor of Rome in 193 CE, Julia did not remain quietly in the shadows. She traveled with him, an unusual thing for an empress, and followed him on long, punishing military campaigns. Where others may have brought silk or jewels, Julia packed books, scrolls, manuscripts, the writings of Aristotle and Plato. She gathered around her an extraordinary circle of thinkers and writers, philosophers, physicians, poets. She was their patron, their guide, their equal. Her court became known not for decadence, but for debate. She was given the title Mater Augustorum, Mother of the Emperors, and later Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps. Her presence among the soldiers made her a symbol of stability, a familiar face beside the throne, a woman both revered and slightly feared. Julia was not a passive ornament to her husband's rule. She was deeply involved in administration, especially when Severus was abroad or ill. She mediated court disputes, She helped decide appointments. She may have even influenced military policy. And when Severus died in 211, it was not the end of her influence. It was the beginning of its most dangerous chapter. Her two sons, Caracalla and Geta, were now co-emperors. But brothers seldom share crowns peacefully. Julia tried desperately to keep peace between them. She held court sessions with both at her side. She mediated arguments. She played the role of the grieving widow, the peacemaker, the mother holding Rome together. But in the end, she failed. One evening, perhaps under the pretense of a family reconciliation, Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's arms. Blood soaked her tunic. Her screams echoed through the palace. Rome, ever full of cruelty, barely blinked. Caracalla, now sole emperor, leaned heavily on his mother, not just as a political adviser, but as the one person he perhaps still respected or at least needed. Julia's power expanded again, not officially, but practically. She oversaw correspondence. She met with ambassadors. She issued edicts in his name. Her name was stamped on imperial documents. And behind closed doors she governed. She walked the razor's edge of empire, neither openly ruling nor quietly retiring. In many ways, she was the mind behind the empire, while Caracalla pursued military campaigns and left governance to those he trusted, and he trusted his mother most. The public loved her. She was seen as wise, gentle, motherly. But within the palace walls, everyone knew she was one of the sharpest minds alive, able to hold her own in any debate, with senators or scholars, in Latin, Greek, or her native tongue. She had transformed the role of the Empress from mere consort to a silent sovereign. But empires are never peaceful for long. Caracalla, increasingly unstable and paranoid, was assassinated in 217 C. His death marked the end of the Severan dynasty's original line. The throne was seized by a general named Macrinus, and Julia, now a widow and mother to a murdered emperor, found herself without formal power for the first time in decades. Macrinus offered her exile. She refused. Some say she chose to starve herself, slowly, in an act of political and personal protest. Others say her death was quiet but intentional, her way of retreating from a world she no longer wished to influence. Either way, she died shortly after Caracalla in Antioch, far from the marble halls of Rome, but still in the heart of empire. Her legacy would not vanish. Though her body was gone, her influence remained like incense on the air, subtle, but impossible to ignore. She had changed the shape of power for women in the Roman world, not with swords or seduction, but with ideas. Even in death, she lingered. Centuries later, scholars would pore over the works written under her patronage. Philosophical treatises, medical texts, histories and dramas. The court she had built had not just advised the empire. It had preserved the knowledge of civilizations. And still the whispers returned. Julia, too intelligent. Julia, too involved. Julia, perhaps the real ruler behind Severus and Caracalla. She was a woman who held the empire together not by fear, but by intellect. And for many, that was more dangerous. Because while power can be seized and titles bestowed, influence is earned. And influence, when possessed by a woman in a world built for men, is often seen not as a gift, but as a threat. Picture her now, if you will, in a silk robe patterned with eastern stars, seated in a candle-lit room, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a scroll. Around her, philosophers debate softly. A physician leans forward, asking her opinion on Galen's theories. A military map lies unrolled on the table, waiting for her thoughts. She does not raise her voice. She does not need to. She listens, she reasons, she decides. In the hush of the night, she is not empress. She is not widow. She is not mother. She is Julia Domna, the philosopher queen. And she, above all the women of Rome, shows us that danger doesn't always come dressed in blood or fire. Sometimes it wears a calm smile and holds a book. Let her story drift with you now into sleep. Let her intellect settle softly across your thoughts, like a warm wind across parchment. The world she ruled may be long gone, but her mind still echoes, quietly, powerfully, dangerously. Fulvia the night wind howled through the narrow alleys of ancient Rome, tugging at the woolen cloaks of passers-by. Somewhere near the Palatine Hill, the lamps flickered, and a woman watched from behind heavy curtains. Not a courtesan, not a servant, not a matron weaving wool for her husband, but Fulvia, the first woman in Roman history to appear publicly in political speeches, to command armies, and to issue edicts in her own name. Born into an aristocratic family around 83 BC, Fulvia was no stranger to power. She was raised among marble columns and rhetorical debates, where names like Cicero, Cato, and Caesar weren't legends. They were neighbors. Her family, the Fulvii, had long been connected to the political undercurrents of the Republic. But Fulvia would not ride upon the reputation of men. She would forge her own. 3 times she married, and each time to a man more radical than the last. First to Publius Clodius Pulcher, the populist firebrand who broke all of Rome's unwritten rules, walking into the women. Only ceremonies of bona fide dressed in disguise, and infuriating Cicero with his antics. Clodius was reckless, beloved by the mob, and utterly uncontainable, and Fulvia adored him. But when Clodius was murdered in 52 BC by the supporters of his political rival Milo, Fulvia didn't just grieve. She displayed his mutilated corpse in the forum, lifting the bloodied cloak for all to see. With grief sharpened into fury, she rallied the people, inflaming the streets with cries for justice. The city boiled, riots broke out. The Curia, the Senate house, burned to the ground. It was one of the first times a Roman woman had led a mob through the streets, and it would not be the last. Her second husband, Gaius Scribonius Curio, was another firebrand, this time allied with Julius Caesar. Fulvia, even in widowhood, had remained active in radical politics. She believed in Caesar's reforms, in land for veterans, in power for the people. When Curio died fighting for Caesar in Africa, Fulvia grieved again. But the wheel of fate turned once more. Her third husband would make her infamous. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, tall, magnetic, brave, a soldier of the people, and yet always caught in the shadow of Caesar. It was Fulvia who saw in him a spark others ignored. She pushed him, backed him, encouraged his political rise. Together they were a whirlwind, a dangerous union of brute strength and fierce intelligence. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Rome plunged into chaos once more. Antony, Octavian, the future Augustus, and Lepidus formed the second triumvirate, splitting the republic like a loaf of stale bread. As Antony marched east, Fulvia remained in Rome, but she didn't just wait. She ruled. It is here, in the dark days of the civil wars, that Fulvia's true danger blossomed. With her husband gone, she did something no woman had done before. She issued decrees, collected taxes, and ordered executions, not as a puppet, not as a wife, but as a sovereign figure acting on behalf of the state. In fact, some scholars believe it was Fulvia, not Antony, who ordered the execution of Cicero, that silver-tongued senator who had once mocked her first husband. His severed head, famously displayed in the forum, had its tongue pierced with a hairpin. A woman's hairpin, they say. Fulvia's, was it revenge, a warning, or political theater? No one knows, but the story stuck because it felt like something only Fulvia would do. Her face now appeared on coins, a terrifying symbol for traditionalists. A woman's image, not as a goddess or an allegory, but as herself. Fulvia, real, dangerous, alive. And then, with Antony still abroad, things boiled over. Octavian, young, calculating, and increasingly wary of Antony's influence, began consolidating power. Fulvia, unwilling to watch her husband's legacy be erased, raised legions. Yes, Fulvia went to war. With her brother-in-law Lucius Antonius, she led the Perusine War in 41 BC, a Roman civil war led by a woman. Picture the scene: Fulvia, in military garb, standing on the walls of Perusia, modern day Perugia, issuing orders, negotiating with generals, rallying troops loyal to Antony's name. The siege lasted for months. Food ran low, disease spread, yet still Fulvia resisted. Octavian eventually crushed the rebellion. Perusia fell, Lucius surrendered, and Fulvia, she escaped. Wounded, hunted, and disgraced, she fled to Greece, hoping to reunite with Antony. But the man she had fought for her husband, her partner in revolution, was no longer the same. Antony, now tangled in the silk, veiled charms of Cleopatra, resented Fulvia for the war she had started. Some say he blamed her entirely. In a cold moment of political necessity, Fulvia was cast aside. Some ancient sources suggest she died of illness. Others hint at suicide, or perhaps even poisoning. The truth lost like so much of her legacy. She was 42. Fulvia's story would be recast in time as a cautionary tale. A woman who overreached, who meddled in men's affairs, who led armies and challenged emperors, Roman writers, most of them loyal to Octavian, would paint her as loud, ambitious, unladylike. But the truth lies beneath their bias. Fulvia was a pioneer, the first Roman woman to wield visible, tangible power on the public stage. Not as a goddess, not as a seductress, but as a general, a ruler, a force. She is often forgotten because she failed. But perhaps that's why she's most important. She burned bright too soon. She broke through the crust of tradition with fire and fury. And though the world wasn't ready to be ruled by a woman like Fulvia, the dent she made in the armor of patriarchy remained. Close your eyes and imagine her now riding through the streets of Rome in a crimson, dyed cloak, dust curling at her heels. Crowds pressing forward, some cheer, some shrink back. Her eyes scan the forum not for admiration, but for opportunity. She raises her voice, not shrill, but commanding. This is a woman not content to whisper from behind a curtain. This is a woman who commands. Yes, Fulvia was dangerous, not because she was cruel, not because she seduced or deceived, but because she dared to believe Rome could be ruled by a woman, and in that belief, brash, unyielding, fatal, she stepped into history as a storm. Let her story drift gently into your thoughts now, as the night deepens and the fires burn low. Let her defiance echo softly, not like a trumpet, but like the murmur of distant hoofbeats approaching, always approaching. Fulvia, the thunder behind the curtain, the forgotten flame of the Republic. And so, as we leave behind the marbled palaces of Rome, the shadowy corridors of power, and the rustle of silks woven with ambition, let us exhale. History does not always reward the boldest. It often forgets the ones who refused to be silent, the women who were too clever, too cunning, too dangerous for comfort. But tonight we remembered them. From Fulvia's battlefield courage to Livia's whispered influence, from Julia's scandalous charm to Messalina's fateful downfall, each of these women carved their names, whether praised or feared, into the bones of empire, and while Roman historians may have called them wicked, mad, or monstrous tonight, we simply call them unforgettable. Let your thoughts drift like olive branches in the wind. Let the flicker of the past settle gently over you, like a warm blanket spun from myth and memory. Let the dangerous women of Rome stand watch in your dreams, not to haunt, but to remind you that strength comes in many forms, and power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Sleep now, the forum is quiet, the torches are dim, and the echoes of empire fade softly into the night. Good night, traveler, and may history guard your dreams."